By now, you should be scratching your heads a little bit, having been exposed to perhaps the first time exposed to Plato and Aristotle. And what I want to do in this lecture is provide some background information to uh, help you to understand these readings more fully, especially if you haven't been exposed to classical thinking. It's almost impossible to overestimate the influence of Plato and Aristotle. I always like to introduce students to books, and a book that's very interesting is entitled The Cave and the Light, the Plato versus Aristotle and the Struggle for the Soul of Western Civilization by Arthur Herman. It's a great historical overview of the influence that Plato and Aristotle have had on Western civilization and Western thinkers. As I said, it's impossible to overestimate their influence. They keep coming back like, I guess, a good penny in some people's estimation. In others, other postmodernists would like to sweep them out of the household of Western philosophy and education, but I'm afraid that's impossible to do. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about their influence on the course readings that we have. And the easiest way to do that is to pair Plato with Augustine, the 5th century church father, late 4th century, early 5th century church father, and to pair Aristotle with Thomas Aquinas, who's writing in the High Middle Ages, the 13th century. What's important here is that these two Christian thinkers, Augustine and Aquinas, took pretty much lock, stock, and barrel the ideas of Plato and the ideas of Aristotle and filled them in and filled them out with Christian content in their theological writings, so that even though Plato, who seemed to believe in hotheos, the God, Aristotle is pretty much silent on the question of God, though the question of God does pop up in his work on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics. Nevertheless, these two Christian thinkers, Augustine in the 5th century of the Christian era, 5th century CE, and Aquinas in the 13th century CE of the Christian era, utilize these thinkers extensively. So the influence of Plato and Aristotle moves beyond the pagan world of ancient Greece and through the Middle Ages and on into the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and even up until contemporary times, their influence is felt significantly. So that's kind of the historical background that I want to give for this. But in addition to that, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about these 3 chapters. Chapters 1 and 7 in our textbook, Traditional Classics on Leadership, are selections from Plato's, his magnum opus, the last thing that he wrote, The Republic. And in The Republic, Plato attempts to answer the question, what is justice? And the word justice in Greek is dikaiosune, which in the New Testament and other places is translated as righteousness. And righteousness is this idea of rightness, that is harmony and symmetry, how things really kind of ought to be in an ideal world. And indeed, the Republic is Plato's attempt at creating an ideal state. So he has a lot to say about leadership because the rulers that he envisions are called philosopher kings, men and women who undergo a rigorous education in order to lead the state, in order to lead the republic. So this first reading that we have is pretty straightforward. In this section of the Republic, one of the earlier sections of the Republic, um, Socrates, who is by this time Plato's mouthpiece, Socrates' real voice can be heard in the earlier dialogues, but here in the later dialogues, like the Republic, it's pretty much Plato through and through. And this Socrates figure, as I said, I think in the last lecture, has often been referred to as Plate Soc, a little puppet that Plato is utilizing to get his ideas across. As far as we know, Socrates really had no interest in metaphysical, philosophical concerns. He was mostly a moral philosopher. He was concerned with how people behaved and how people treated each other. At any rate, in this section of the Republic, Thrasymachus is making his argument that that one should be concerned only with one's own interest and one's own power, and to hell with the interests of the others. So basically, Thrasymachus is arguing that morality and philosophy should be concerned with the self and the self alone. I and I alone matter. And if I have the power to get you to do what I want you to do, that is the wealth and the military might, then that's the way life should be. In short, Thrasymachus is making an early argument for might makes right. The powerful have the right to do whatever they can do in order to get others to cooperate. On the other hand, Socrates is challenging and attempting to dismantle Thrasymachus's argument about self-interest. And he's arguing that really, if you think about certain kinds of situations, the central metaphor for Thrasymachus in this section of the Republic is that of a shepherd and it's his sheep. And Thrasymachus says, well, a shepherd takes care of the sheep, but only so that he can slaughter them later and eat them, or sell them later and make money. And what Socrates attempts to do by the end of this section is to overturn that argument and say, Thrasymachus, hidden within your argument was the undoing of that very argument. In fact, the shepherd's main concern is not with himself, not with feeding himself, but tending to his flock. Even if later he might eat some of them or have them shorn or sell them in a marketplace, the shepherd's main concern is with his flock or her flock. And that means that it's not really all about oneself. One, as a leader, needs to be concerned with the others, in this case, the shepherd with his sheep. And then there are two other metaphors in here that that Socrates utilizes, beginning on page 8 and continuing on page 9. Socrates provides the example of the physician and the ship captain, and argues that the physician really is less concerned about his or her own self and more concerned about his or her patients. And the same is true of a ship captain. A ship captain, in order for the ship to sail successfully, has to be concerned about the ship itself, its condition, and also about the crew members. So that both of these metaphors serve to underline Socrates' main argument that one ought not to be solely concerned with oneself as a leader or manager or supervisor or whatever, but one must be concerned with the needs of the followers, the needs of those people entrusted to him or her. And that's basically what's going on here. Page 11 of this reading, look over that a little bit more carefully, this is where Socrates kind of clinches the argument and goes back to the metaphor of the shepherd and says, really, the shepherd is more concerned with his sheep than anything else. And on pages 12 and 13, it's there's some really interesting things. Socrates says that the stronger ought to be not as interested in one's own self, strength, power, position, but in the interests of the weaker and attempt to raise the weaker up. And I think there's a really interesting statement at the bottom of page 12 where Socrates says, it's tough to be a ruler and it's easy to be corrupted. And he says, for that reason, good men are unwilling to rule, either for money's sake or for honor. They have no wish to be called mercenary for demanding to be paid, and so on and so forth. I think it's fascinating. I know one thinker I really appreciate has said, don't trust people who are happy to step up and take charge of your lives. Don't trust people who are really anxious to get in that ruling position, in that position of power. Rather, the person who resists the personal power and wealth, the person who's more interested in ideas, in knowledge, and in protecting the interests of the weaker, those are the people you should really trust. I think there are some good lessons in this first selection for us today and our current political environment. That said, no, I won't move on to that yet, but I will move on to chapter 7 of the Republic. And in this section, there is something that you need to understand because Plato here is talking about ideas and ideals. And the most critical part of this is that we get, for the first time probably in Western history, a list of the characteristics of philosopher kings. And this is probably the first example, at least in a secular text, of a great man theory. So on page 61, you get a list of the kinds of traits that we should have in these philosopher kings, in these people who are going to rule in the Republic. They have to care about truth. They have to have a love of truth and a hatred of falsehood. They have to have a love of wisdom more than a love of wealth and other things. They have to have this philosophic nature, that is, this ability to parse ideas and separate good from bad ideas, and on and on and on. Fair-minded, gentle, and sociable. And they have to be quick to learn and to grow, and so on and so forth. So I'll let you look those over. But I want to share with you something that's absolutely critical to to understanding this particular selection. And it's a little bit abstract, but some of you may have seen it before. It's called the divided line of Plato. And I want to share this little handout with you. It's called the divided line. And here again is a selection from Plato's The Republic. And this divided line idea precedes the myth of the cave in the Republic. And here's a text. I'll make this available to you, where Socrates basically says, what I want to do is I want to divide the world, both how we think, epistemology, and what actually exists, ontology, in half. And on the upper half is what Socrates, actually Plato, wants to call the intelligible world. This is the world of ideas. And below that is the visible world. And that's the world of the five senses, the world that we experience on a day to day basis as we live and move and have our being. And again, I'm not going to read this whole selection, but he then divides again the uh, the two sections so that in the end you actually end up with four levels, and the four levels look like this. On the upper half of the divided line, you have the realm or the world of the invisible, the intangible, the permanent, and the changeless. And this can be further subdivided on the right into knowing, ideas, and thinking. And then on the bottom half of the initial divided line, you have the realm or the world of the visible, what we see, the tangible, what we taste, the appearance, what we see, feel, and touch. And this is not a changeless world. This world is in flux and changing all the time. And on the right-hand side, which is the epistemology, that is what we know, we have people's beliefs, people's opinions, and images. That is things that we see. And it's been argued that we've moved in these last decades from a kind of literate culture, that is a culture based on reading and thinking, which would be above the divided line here, to a culture of images, images that flash across our computer screens and our phone screens, and are basically driven by these things and are pretty much caught up here in this lowest level of knowledge, that is images. Because what happens in this way of thinking is that we live here with images and beliefs, all sorts of people with all sorts of opinions about all sorts of things, arguing with each other, trying to get the best of others in the marketplace of popular ideas. But the real work, Socrates and Plato argue, is in thinking through good and bad ideas and knowing the truth and ultimately the highest good. So if we translate that more into something we would think about today, in the divided line at the top, you have knowing and thinking again. And this is knowledge that's available for thinking that includes a pursuit of the good. What is the ultimate good in life? Are we able to identify that rationally? Um, Plato and Socrates, well, Plato felt that you could. And Plato felt that, of course, it was the life of the mind, which is why he's probably the father of Western philosophy. And that pursuit would be done, of course, by the philosopher kings, but also by any and all who are interested in the pursuit of knowledge as a vocation. Thinking takes place in the realm of mathematics, science, and other means of systematic observation and analysis. So you can see that the way that the world is organized in terms of ideas is also done above the divided line in the intelligible realm. Down below the divided line in the sensible realm, this is believing, opinion, imaging, images, right? Knowledge which is available through proverbs or other pithy sayings, the kinds of things that we say to each other every day. And also knowledge available through films and television, and of course our smartphones. So in order to understand chapter 7, of this textbook, which is another selection from the Republic, Plato's masterpiece, you have to know that when he talks about the ideal person, the person who's pursuing a life of a philosopher king, for example, he's assuming that you understand this divided line, that this pursuit of ideas is far more important than the pursuit of material wealth or popularity or fame or success or anything else. So this selection, chapter 7, when you roll through this, we're going to talk about the just and the unjust person again, or the righteous or the unrighteous person, and philosopher kings who should desire, according to Plato on page 59, wisdom and knowledge in order to successfully uh, rule their people. And again, on 61, we get the traits of philosopher kings, and that is probably the first setting forth of a great man theory. And at pages 63 and following, Socrates comes back to the ship metaphor, and we'll talk about how the present rulers, according to Plato, in 5th century into 4th century BCE Greece, are more like sailors on the ship. They have no idea where they're going or what they're doing. And what they really need is a captain. They need a philosopher king who's going to be able to guide the ship and guide the sailors from port to port safely. And then on page 65, Socrates, as Plato's mouthpiece, says that the most important thing for leaders to pursue is the truth. And the truth occurs up in this realm here. So I think it's interesting to bring this up because do we really talk much about truth in this postmodern world? What does it mean to talk about truth and to say that leaders, managers, ought to be concerned with truth and with truth as the most important pursuit? I think that, of course, in the marketplace of capitalism, it's not so much truth that's pursued, but wealth. And for a corporation to be viable, especially in a pandemic, you've got to make money, and you've got to think about making money, and you've got to think about the bottom line. So what becomes more important than the truth about a particular product is marketing and selling the product. And I think Socrates would have a lot to say about that, and so would Plato. The rest of this selection in chapter 7 has to do with the fact that 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 the idea of philosopher kings, although abstract and apparently unattainable, is nevertheless a great ideal. So even if we never achieve this, he argues we ought to aspire for that, and that should be our pursuit if we are to be leaders and managers. So that's the first two selections, chapters 1 and 7. And if you flip with me now, you might want to have your books open to chapter 2. We come to Aristotle's Politics and the selection that we have here, and in it he's he's arguing that that an oligarchy or a monarchy is to be preferred to democracy. And you'll have to remember that both Plato and Aristotle are set against democracies because they believe that the hoi polloi, the many, the ignorant, unwashed masses, do not have the capability of ruling. So that's the background for this. And I'll share with you one more uh, slide. I guess I have to do the share now, present now. And this is a list of Aristotle's ethics table of virtues and vices. And I think if you understand this, um, you'll better understand what Aristotle is after when he talks, for example, about virtue on page 15 and comes back to issues related to having laws and a constitution, because not all men and women are virtuous. Then finally, on page 21, in order to ensure that human beings are allowed to pursue virtue, arete, which really is a translation of, well, another translation for arete, the word translated virtue, is excellence, the pursuit of excellence on page 21. So the role of laws and a constitution for Athens would be in order to allow people to pursue their um, their best interests, but also to pursue excellence. So the way this table is set up is you've got a sphere of action or feeling. Then you have the excess, which is too much of something. And then you have the deficiency, which is too little of something. And the mean between these two extremes, often referred to as the golden mean, is what we should all aspire to. So, for example, in the realm of fear and confidence, too much, too much fear or too much confidence leads to rashness, and too little leads to cowardice. But the mean between the extremes of rashness and cowardice is courage. In terms of pleasure and pain, too much of something is self indulgence, too little of something is insensibility. And the mean between these two extremes is temperance, right? Getting and spending. The too much of something is prodigality. Remember the parable of the prodigal son who gives everything away, gives up his inheritance, and well, takes it and spends it and loses it. Um, that's too much when you give too much away, right? The deficiency is meanness or illiberality. That is where you are a penny pincher and don't give to others. The mean between these two extremes is liberality, and so on down. Self-expression, how we present ourselves to others. Too much of this is boasting. Too little is our mock modesty, our understatement of the value of ourselves. And the mean between these two extremes, the golden mean, is truthfulness. So I'll make this handout available for you to see. But it's important to understand what Aristotle is doing here in the Nicomachean Ethics in order to make sense of this selection that you have in chapter 2, taken from the Hepoliteia, the politics. So regardless of the kind of government that you have, like Plato, Aristotle believed that the person should be virtuous. And one becomes a virtuous person, a person of arete, a person of excellence, if you make excellent choices in all of those areas that I went through on that chart of virtue, vices, and the golden mean. As you make excellent choices and strive for the golden mean between the extremes of too much of something or too little of something, you will eventually develop habits, excellent habits. And these excellent habits eventuate in a character of excellence. You become an excellent person, or you become a virtuous person. So, like Plato, when it comes to leaders, whether you're talking about a monarch or an oligarchy, which is preferred to a democracy, I think this is very interesting. Um, these leaders, whether it's a group of leaders, an aristocratic group, or an oligarchic group, they need to be virtuous. They need to be living this virtuous life that Aristotle sets forward. Or if you have a monarch, a single person ruling, Aristotle would argue that that person needs to be virtuous. That person basically needs to be an excellent person, a person who has developed excellent habits because he or she has made excellent choices and has developed this excellent character or virtuous character in order to lead the state. So these selections and these two works, the Republic by Plato and the Politics by Aristotle, pretty much undergird all of our thinking in the West, and certainly in this course, which is about Western, not Eastern thinkers. There's just not enough time to do them all, to cover Confucian, Buddhist, Taoist, Shinto ideals, Hindu ideals of leadership. This is just about the West. I wish we did have a course that allowed us to explore those other options because they're certainly important. From the so-called East. But these two works, Politics by Aristotle and the Republic by Plato, pretty much undergird our thinking of what it means to come together as a state and what kinds of people need to be leading us, whether philosopher kings or a group of aristocrats or a monarch, a king or a queen. And so both Plato and Aristotle start out our discussion of history and theories of leadership with two slightly different visions of the so-called great man, or in Plato's case, the great woman theory, because he certainly, although he was conservative and unbending in many other ways, would allow for women to be philosopher kings if they could go through the rigorous kind of training required for it. That's it for now. I hope this helps you get a sense of these readings. I'm going to try to do one of these lectures every week to provide the background going forward because we're going to move through this course historically. We're going to jump ahead about, well, 400 to 1,000 years and move into the so-called Middle Ages. And then the Reformation, the Renaissance. I think we have 2 weeks on the modern period, and we'll do 1 week on postmodernism. So it's a grand sweep done in a short 8-week period. But I hope that these lectures will help to provide the necessary background to help you get at these readings, which, as you know by now, are difficult. Now, I know Wren et al. Provide short introductions to these readings, but I don't think it's sufficient. And I really prefer doing this in a face-to-face classroom, but hey, this is what we've got. So I'm going to try to accommodate you by providing these lectures. Let me know if it helps. Take care. Talk soon.